Paris, summer, 1889. Armand Peugeot stood beside his steam tricycle at the Paris Universal Exhibition, watching another potential customer walk away shaking his head. The newly completed Eiffel Tower gleamed in the afternoon sun beyond the exhibition halls, a monument to what modern engineering could achieve. Armand's 4 prototypes, the Peugeot Type 1, sat arranged in a prominent location, their exposed boilers and complex tubing on full display. Around him, thousands of inventions competed for attention. Electric lights, Edison's phonograph, machines that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. His machines were pushing boundaries too, but in the wrong direction. The morning had started with promise. A well-dressed gentleman had spent 20 minutes examining the tricycles, asking technical questions about the flash boiler system, the steam pressure, the horsepower output. But when Armand explained the warm-up time, how long it took to build sufficient steam pressure before the vehicle could move, the man had simply nodded politely and moved on to the next exhibit. It had been the same story all week. Fascination, yes. Questions, certainly. But when it came to the practical realities of ownership, the weight, the complexity, the cost, potential buyers disappeared like steam dissipating into the air. Armand was 40 years old, an engineer from the prestigious École Centrale in Paris, and he had gambled his reputation on these 4 vehicles. Worse, he had convinced his family to invest in this experiment, pulling resources away from their profitable saw and bicycle businesses. His cousins Eugène and Robert had been skeptical from the start. Now, standing in Paris with vehicles nobody wanted to buy, Armand knew they'd been right to worry. One of the tricycles hissed softly as its boiler cooled. The sound seemed to mock him. 5 horsepower of steam engine, capable of 16 miles per hour in theory. In practice, it was a beautiful, expensive failure. He had been so certain. The collaboration with Léon Serpollet, the inventor of the revolutionary flash boiler. The months of careful construction at the Terre Blanche factory. The workers who had puzzled over how to build something that looked like a bicycle frame stretched to grotesque proportions, topped with all that metal tubing and cylinders. Every component had been crafted with precision, leveraging the Peugeot family's expertise in metalworking. And yet here he stood, watching his dream evaporate like water from an overheated boiler. Then, across the exhibition hall, he noticed a crowd gathering around a different display. The voices were animated, excited. Curious, Armand walked closer. It was a German inventor named Gottlieb Daimler, demonstrating something called an internal combustion engine. To understand why Armand Peugeot was standing at the Paris exhibition with 4 failing steam tricycles, you have to go back to 1888 to the metalworking valleys of Montbéliard in eastern France. The Peugeot family had been manufacturing since 1810. What began as a steel foundry had evolved into a diverse enterprise producing saws, coffee mills, umbrella frames, anything that could be forged from quality steel. By 1888, they employed over 2,000 workers across 3 factories along the Doubs River. Their logo, a lion walking on an arrow, symbolized the speed, strength, and flexibility of their saw blades. The lion had made them famous across Europe. Armand Peugeot, born in 1849, had joined the family business after completing his engineering education. But where his cousin saw a thriving metalworking operation making steady profits, Armand saw limitation. The bicycle boom of the 1880s had shown him something. People wanted mobility, personal mobility. The ability to travel under their own power faster than walking without depending on horses or trains. Peugeot had entered bicycle manufacturing in 1882, and by the late 1880s they were producing thousands annually. But bicycles still required human power. Armand became fascinated by the next evolution, vehicles that moved by themselves. In 1888, a letter arrived from Léon Serpollet. The French inventor had developed a flash boiler, a system that could instantly convert water to steam in small tubes, eliminating the massive, heavy boilers that made most steam vehicles impractical. Serpollet wanted to build a steam-powered vehicle. He needed a manufacturer with precision metalworking capabilities. Armand read the letter 3 times. This was his chance. The family meeting did not go well. Eugene and Robert pointed to the bicycle profits. Why risk capital on unproven technology? Steam engines were heavy, complicated, dangerous. The market for personal vehicles didn't exist yet. Focus on what worked: hand tools and bicycles. But Armand persisted. He wasn't proposing to abandon their core business, just to experiment with a small collaboration. Think of the prestige if it worked. Think of being first. Eventually, reluctantly, they agreed to a limited trial. Work began at the Terre Blanche factory on the Allen River. Armand assigned his engineer Rigoulot to collaborate with Serpollet. They redesigned the frame to be sturdier, applying Peugeot's expertise in thin metal rods, the same techniques they used for bicycle spokes. They combined Serpollet's flash boiler with a 4-cylinder steam engine from the La Bouire company of Léon. The construction took months. Workers accustomed to making coffee grinders and saw blades found themselves welding together 3-wheeled contraptions that seemed more sculpture than machine. The frame had to be strong enough to support the boiler and engine while remaining light enough to actually move. By summer 1889, they had completed 4 prototypes. The Peugeot Type 1 represented one of the first industrially manufactured automobiles in the world. On paper, the specifications were impressive: 5 horsepower from the oil-fired boiler, theoretical top speed of 16 miles per hour, a revolutionary flash boiler system that avoided the bulk of traditional steam engines. Testing revealed the problems. Yes, it moved, but it was heavy. The vibrations from the engine loosened bolts and made the ride uncomfortable. Maintaining steam pressure required constant attention, and the warm-up time, the minutes required before the vehicle could move, made it impractical for spontaneous travel. Still, Armand had secured space at the Paris Universal Exhibition. Perhaps seeing them displayed alongside the century's other great inventions would generate interest. Perhaps the prestige of the exhibition would overcome the practical limitations, which was how Armand Peugeot ended up standing in Paris in 1889, watching potential customers walk away from his beautiful, expensive failures. Armand pushed through the crowd around Daimler's display. The German inventor was demonstrating a compact engine that ran on gasoline. Compared to the steam engines Armand had been working with for the past year, Daimler's design seemed almost impossibly small. Yet it was producing power, running smoothly without any of the bulk or complexity of steam. He listened as Daimler explained the principles. Internal combustion, controlled explosions of gasoline vapor driving pistons, no boiler, no warm-up time. Turn a crank, and it started. It ran until you ran out of fuel. Armand's engineering training kicked in. He began calculating. If that engine could be adapted to a wheeled frame, something lighter than what he'd built for steam, you could have a vehicle that was practical. Not just theoretically possible, but actually useful for everyday transportation. A man standing next to Daimler noticed Armand's interest. His name was Émile Levasseur. He explained that his company, Panhard et Levasseur, had acquired the rights to manufacture Daimler engines in France. They were producing them under license primarily for industrial applications, but the potential for vehicles was obvious. The 3 men talked for over an hour. Daimler described the engine's development. Levasseur explained the manufacturing process and the licensing arrangements. And Armand shared his experience with the steam tricycles. What had worked, what hadn't. What he'd learned about building practical vehicles. By the time they finished talking, Armand knew what he had to do. Abandon steam. Build a new vehicle around an internal combustion engine. Start over from the beginning, taking everything he'd learned from the Type 1 failure and applying it to a completely different approach. There was a complication. The Daimler engine patents in France were controlled by the widow of Edouard Sarrazin, who had been Daimler's Paris agent. Levasseur would need to negotiate the rights to supply engines to Peugeot. It would take time and money, but standing there, looking at Daimler's compact engine running smoothly beside his own bulky steam tricycles, Armand felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Certainty. This was the answer. Armand returned to Montbéliard in the fall of 1889, a different man. The exhibition had been humbling. Watching potential customers reject his steam tricycles had been painful. But discovering Daimler's engine had transformed the failure into opportunity. He knew what wouldn't work. Now he knew what would. The negotiations with the widow Sarrazin took months. Finally, in February 1890, a contract was signed. Panhard et Levasseur would supply Daimler engines to Peugeot at a royalty of 12% per engine, 144 francs each. Armand now had access to the technology he needed, but he also had to convince his family again. They had invested in the steam tricycles and those had failed. Why should they trust his judgment about gasoline engines? Armand's argument was simple. He had learned from the failure. The steam tricycles taught them what made vehicles impractical: weight, complexity, warm-up time. The gasoline engine solved all three problems. It was lighter, it was simpler. It started immediately, and he wasn't asking them to take his word for it. Daimler had proven the technology worked. Reluctantly, the family agreed to fund one more experiment. Work began on the Type 2 at the Valentinier plant in spring 1890. This would be completely different from the steam tricycles. 4 wheels instead of 3 for better stability. A lightweight frame inspired by bicycle construction. And at its heart, a 2-cylinder Panhard Daimler engine with 565 cubic centimeters of displacement, producing 2 horsepower. 2 horsepower sounded modest, and it was. But the entire vehicle would weigh significantly less than the steam tricycles. Weight mattered more than raw power. The engineering challenges were substantial. Engine cooling remained an unsolved problem in the 1880s. The solution Armand's team developed was a system of water-filled tubes surrounding the engine cylinders. A primitive but functional radiator, one of the first in automotive history. The engine was mounted under the seat, above and slightly ahead of the rear axle, connected by a chain drive. The vehicle featured a 3-point suspension system, credited as the first proper automobile suspension, making the ride smoother and more controlled. A sliding gear transmission allowed the driver to change speeds. Every component was examined for weight reduction. The frame design incorporated lessons from both the failed steam tricycles and Peugeot's extensive bicycle manufacturing experience. The wheelbase was 1,400 millimeters, supporting a vehicle length of 2,300 millimeters. 4 Type 2 prototypes were built between 1890 and 1891. 3 were 4-wheeled quadricycles. The 4th was a 3-wheeled variant, testing different configurations to see what worked best. The moment of truth came in early 1891. Armand climbed into the first Type 2 prototype, turned the hand crank, and felt the engine catch and roar to life. No warm-up time, no waiting for steam pressure to build, just immediate mechanical power. He released the brake and felt the vehicle lurch forward. The sensation was nothing like the steam tricycles. It was lighter, more responsive. The suspension absorbed bumps in the road. The engine ran smoothly without the violent vibrations that had plagued the Type 1. Top speed was 18 kilometers per hour, about 11 miles per hour. By modern standards, barely faster than a brisk walk. But in 1891, sitting in a vehicle that moved under its own power with no horses, no steam warm-up, and reasonable reliability, it felt like the future. The Type 2 was functional. It was practical. People might actually want to own one. In October 1891, Peugeot delivered its first customer vehicle, a Type 3, an evolution of the Type 2 with refinements based on testing. It was the beginning of production automobile manufacturing at Peugeot. But Armand knew that selling these vehicles would require more than just building them. He needed to prove their durability to skeptical buyers who still saw automobiles as expensive toys that would break down constantly. In 1891, he decided on a bold demonstration. The Paris-Brest-Paris cycle race was a punishing 1,200-kilometer route across northwestern France. Armand would follow the race route in his Type 3, proving that the vehicle could handle long distances and rough roads. The journey was grueling. Roads in 1891 France were designed for horses and carts, not motorized vehicles. The Type 3 rattled over cobblestones, climbed hills, navigated muddy tracks. But it kept running. When Armand completed the route and returned to Paris, he had his proof. These vehicles could work for real-world transportation. Orders began to come in. 29 vehicles were built in 1892. The number grew to 40 in 1894, 72 in 1895, 156 in 1898. By 1899, Peugeot sold 300 cars. 1/4 of all cars sold in France that year. The family tensions that had simmered since 1888 finally came to a head in 1896. Armand's cousins still saw automobiles as a risky distraction from the profitable core business of tools and bicycles. Armand saw automobiles as the future. The disagreement was irreconcilable. Armand broke away from Les Fils de Peugeot Frères to form his own company, Société Anonyme des Automobiles Peugeot. He built a new factory at Audincourt with 50,000 square meters of production space, dedicated entirely to automobile manufacturing. By 1896, Peugeot had also developed its own engine, an 8-horsepower horizontal twin, freeing the company from dependence on Panhard Daimler licenses. Cars began to be produced with engines mounted in front, the configuration that would become standard across the industry. The range expanded dramatically. By 1899, the Peugeot catalog included 15 different models, from 2-seaters to 12-seat vehicles, weighing between 720 and 1,250 kilograms. There were feuilletons, vis-a-vis models, tiny cars that didn't require a driver's license, and 8-seat estate wagons. Peugeot also understood that racing would drive both innovation and publicity. In 1894, the company entered 5 cars in the Paris-Rouen trials, generally regarded as the world's first motor race. Albert Lemaitre drove a Peugeot with a 3-horsepower engine. All 5 Peugeots finished the race. Lemaitre crossed the finish line second, 3.5 minutes behind the Comte de Dion's steam-powered vehicle, which was disqualified because the rules specified practical passenger vehicles. Lemaitre was declared the winner. These racing successes demonstrated that Peugeot's engineering was sound and generated publicity that made potential buyers take the company seriously. By the turn of the century, Peugeot was producing 500 cars annually along with 20,000 bicycles. They were pioneering innovations that would become industry standards: rubber tires on gasoline-powered cars, new transmission systems, hoods to protect engines, steering wheels instead of levers. By 1903, Peugeot was producing half of all cars manufactured in France. The company that had started with 4 failing steam tricycles at the Paris exhibition had become one of Europe's leading automobile manufacturers. Looking back from the perspective of the early 1900s, that moment at the Paris Universal Exhibition in 1889 becomes clearer. Armand Peugeot, standing beside his steam tricycles, watching potential customers walk away, was experiencing what every pioneer eventually faces. The first attempt doesn't work. The question is whether you recognize what the failure is teaching you. The steam-powered Type 1 was a failure by any practical measure. Only 4 were built. None achieved commercial viability. They were too heavy, too complex, too impractical. But that failure gave Armand something invaluable: clarity about what wouldn't work. If he had succeeded with the steam tricycles, if customers at the exhibition had placed orders, if the vehicles had been profitable, Peugeot might have spent years trying to refine steam technology, investing resources in improving something that was fundamentally limited. The failure freed him to look for better solutions, and at that same exhibition, literally in the same building where his steam tricycles were being rejected, was the answer: Daimler's internal combustion engine. Technology that was lighter, simpler, more practical. All Armand had to do was recognize it. That recognition, the ability to pivot from one approach to another based on what the evidence showed, was more important than any single technical innovation. The Type 2 wasn't revolutionary because of its engine or suspension or transmission. It was revolutionary because it represented learning from failure and adapting. The company Armand founded, despite family resistance, would outlive him by more than a century. He died in 1915, having seen his automobile company grow into one of Europe's major manufacturers. Peugeot would go on to produce revolutionary engines, win the Indianapolis 503 times before 1920, and become one of the oldest continuously operating automobile manufacturers in the world. Today, Peugeot's three-digit naming system, established in 1929 with the 201, still identifies its vehicles. The lion logo still marks every car it produces. But the true beginning wasn't the Type 2's success, or the Type 3's production run, or the racing victories. It was that moment at the Paris exhibition in 1889. Armand standing beside his failed steam tricycles, watching another potential customer walk away, and then noticing the crowd around Daimler's display. That moment of crisis when everything he'd worked for seemed to be collapsing, and he had to decide whether to defend his investment in steam power or admit the failure and look for something better. He chose to look. The legacy of the first Peugeot isn't about technical specifications or production numbers. It's about understanding that innovation requires the courage to fail, the humility to recognize when you've failed, and the curiosity to find better answers. The Type 1 steam tricycles were necessary because they showed what wouldn't work. The Type 2 gasoline vehicles succeeded because they embodied the lessons learned from that failure. In the metalworking valleys of Montbéliard, where the Dow River still flows past old factory buildings, where the Peugeot Museum preserves those early vehicles, you can see that progression. From hand tools to bicycles, to steam tricycles, to gasoline vehicles, to modern automobiles. Each step built on the last. Each failure taught the next lesson. The lion logo that marked the first Peugeot cars symbolized speed, strength, and flexibility. Qualities originally meant to describe saw blades. But those qualities turned out to describe something more important. The adaptability required to pioneer an entirely new industry when your first attempt fails. Your family doubts you, and the technology you need doesn't exist yet until you find it demonstrated at the same exhibition where your own failures are on display. The first Peugeot car was really two cars, the one that didn't work and the one that did. Armand Peugeot understood that both were necessary, that you sometimes have to build what fails in order to learn how to build what succeeds. That understanding, more than any engine design or racing victory, was his real innovation. And it was born in a moment of crisis at the 1889 Paris Universal Exhibition, standing beside four steam tricycles that nobody wanted, watching a crowd gather around a German inventor's gasoline engine, and having the courage to admit that everything he'd built was wrong, and the vision to see what could replace it. That moment changed the world, not because of what Armand had built, but because of what he was willing to abandon in order to build something better. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives. What other automotive stories should I cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if you'd like to support this channel, you can buy me a coffee via Revolut. Details are in the description. Every bit helps me keep researching and creating these stories for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.